Lead balloons.
Lead balloons.
The alchemy of unpopular opinions.
Unpopular opinions.
Yeah, I feel a little spicy today, so all bets are off.
And I know that you're out to get the ladies.
We're not encouraged to think critically.
Life is hard. It's supposed to be hard.
Oh my god. That's hilarious. Busted.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. And today you'll notice that Joel and I are not separated by distance or plexiglass. He's joining me here in Lakewood, Colorado. And thanks for coming out, Joel. We've been enjoying Denver, Colorado Springs, doing some hiking.
Got some beers, went and saw that really posh hotel. What was it called?
The Broadmoor
Hotel.
Hotel.
The Garden of the Gods,
Yeah.
which was amazing.
We enjoyed just hanging out, but ended up, unsurprisingly, riffing quite a bit to generate new ideas for upcoming podcasts and expanding the repertoire a little bit. So we've had a great time. And today we're talking, the title of today's episode is Genesis versus Science. And we chose that title specifically as Genesis versus Science, not and science, on purpose, to highlight the conflict between these two. We believe there's a conflict between religion and science. Some people will say things like faith and reason or religion and science. There was a scientist named Stephen Jay Gould who talked about the non-overlapping magisteria, referring to religion and science, that they dealt with different things. So the big question that we're asking today is, can scientific knowledge and religious belief be reconciled?
Mm-hmm.
Are they integratable? Are they reconcilable?
Sure.
And the overarching question that we want you to be thinking about, and Joel and I are going to be thinking about, we'll come back to, is this: what happens to our relationship with the Bible in general, and Genesis in particular, when knowledge of our world grows?
When it expands, yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
When the knowledge base expands. So Joel, you and I, we sat through many Sunday school lessons, sermons, lectures about the validity of the biblical story of creation. And they were pretty impressive, Could you share with us about a particular instance where you were impressed, bewildered, amused, or unhorsed by a presentation of the creation tale?
Sure. I'll put it in a broader context. And I was always pretty amenable to everything that I was being taught. It wasn't until I was much later in college I began to really go, like, I don't know if that makes sense. But I had this very impressive experience. My church would bring in evangelists that would travel in, and there's this one guy who was strong in a movement called dispensationalism. It believes the whole Bible is broken into certain dispensations. And he had this chart that was like 10 feet tall and maybe 40 feet wide. It covered the whole backdrop of the stage. And it was just covered with these like 1970s illustrations with angels and demons and dragons, a lot of the eschatology, like end of times kind of left behind sort of is tied to these beliefs. But I remember in the far left, creation, it had like the literal days. It had like this place called Abraham's bosom, which I remember as a kid going like, this feels very like homoerotic. I don't know why are we all in Abraham's bosom? What does that mean to a 10-year-old? But I do remember his presentation was so impressive. The guy had like most of the Bible memorized in King James, of course. And so I was just, it was a very impressive display and presentation of creation.
Hard to forget. It was an imprint moment. One of my main memories of discussion of the origin of the universe, a number of years ago, I was talking to a pastor, and I had just started learning more about Big Bang cosmology and how the universe was like 13 or so billion years old, and the Earth like 6 billion, whatever it is. And I asked him, I said, do you believe in that the Earth is young, like 6,000 years old, or do you believe that the Earth and the universe are really, really old? And he said to me, Trent, it's quite possible that when God created the universe and created the Earth, that he made it to appear like it was really, really old. And boy, I walked away from that just thinking, man, this is interesting. I guess that what we have to do right now is just stop having a logical conversation, because if that's the answer for any difficult question or sort of scientific related question, there's really no discussion. You just answer everything that's tricky with God made it to be that way.
Yeah, I know. It's that explanation has always been just maddening to me. Like, God's like Loki, this divine trickster. We all get up to heaven. He's like, you thought the earth was old? Gotcha.
Mic drop.
Totally fooled you guys.
Okay, so today we're talking about science, and science, even the word has been controversial over the past 3 years in light of like the COVID pandemic. So let's define our terms a little bit. What do we mean by science? Joel, would you mind elaborating a little bit more about what we mean when we say science, and let's say the scientific method?
Sure. Just a qualification first. I'm not a scientist professionally. My interest is because I'm interested in the truth and collecting what I find to be reasonable data points. So my understanding of science, just as I think anyone who's gone to high school will understand, it's a observational process of looking at the physical world, the observable world, using experimentation, and therefore using that experimentation to test hypotheses with evidence. And so science is the process of creating hypotheses and then testing them through observable metrics to see whether or not the evidence fits the hypotheses. And if it doesn't, you change your hypotheses. And if it does, you keep going and you develop theories, which then, if over a period of time continue to be buttressed by the evidence, then it becomes laws. We have very few scientific laws and a lot of theories. So that's kind of my understanding of it. And the best illustration or understanding that I was presented with when I was in seminary was, we read a guy named Thomas Kuhn. I actually took a biblical course on Genesis and science. It had the "and" because we were trying really hard to reconcile everything. But Thomas Kuhn was a philosopher of science. So he approached science as a philosophy, and he thought about it, and he wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I think that's what it's called. But he coined the phrase paradigm shift. Everyone uses that phrase now, but back in, I think, 1960s when he wrote this book, he was saying science isn't this up and to the right movement. It's just constantly moving up and to the right. We get more information and we just naturally just kind of grow. He says, no, it's more like stair steps. And what happens is there will be a theory that fits the evidence, and we kind of like doing normal science on that. So a good paradigm shift of a scientific revolution might be the way we view the universe. It used to be it used to be geocentric. The Earth, geo, is the center of the universe. And then you get people like Copernicus and Galileo who demonstrate that the evidence of how these the moon and the sun and the planets and stars are moving does not fit a geocentric model. So with their evidence, that would be the stair step. There is a paradigm shift now, and normal science is done upon a heliocentric model. Some of this has happened with physics. We used to be on Newtonian mechanical physics, but discoveries with Einstein and stuff all of a sudden change our understanding, and we start doing normal science on there. So science isn't this thing that's just gradually growing. We are working on old theories, and then we use those theories until they get replaced with better ones. And so that's kind of my understanding. And just to your point about how science gets thrown around from the pandemic, I just want to tell you a little story real quick. So I was still pastoring when everything hit with COVID, and all the churches are being shut down, and there's such aggressive opinions about whether or not we should be meeting in person. And I'm not going to go into that right now. I have opinions. But on our board, there was someone whose husband was a doctor, and she kept advocating for a lot of restraint and making sure that if we show any videos, we got to put on masks, we got to do all these things. She was very, very adamant, and she kept saying, the science says, and I never said anything in those meetings, but this is what I thought: there's no such thing as the science. That's not how science works. science is tested and slowly proven over time through peer-reviewed journals, through very like questioning and skepticism. Is this hypothesis true? And the truth is, we had no real science. We didn't have time to do it. And so people talking about the science in the midst of decision making during that time frame, it had nothing to do with actual science. It just had to do with polemics. That's and so I want to call that out. A lot of what people call the science is just really people trying to strong arm their opinion by calling science just opinions. It's not actually evidence yet.
Would be in some ways like saying, "Oh, we have knowledge about this." Oh, yes, but are you aware of the knowledge?
Yeah.
It starts sounding like Dianetics
Yeah.
and like Christian Science.
The
Are you aware
knowledge.
of the knowledge? Well, no, it's knowledge an abstract concept. It's not sort of concretizable. The knowledge. Okay.
And then, science has to be interpreted.
Yeah.
That's where you begin to go like, what does the data mean?
Mhm.
And it takes time to kind of wade through that.
And one of my favorite scientists, a current scientist named Donald Hoffman, who does a lot of research on consciousness. And one of the things that he says is he wants to state, this is part of the scientific method, is to state as clearly as possible what your hypothesis is,
Mm-hmm.
so that people will know how to disagree with you and where it might be wrong.
Yeah.
It's this concept we could go into more of falsifiability. Give me a proposition such that you yourself could tell me what would falsify that, which is a big difference between that and faith. Faith is related to things that usually aren't capable of being falsified.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to investigate them with the normal tools that we have at our disposal.
Science really isn't interested in metaphysics, which is where kind of like spirituality kind of lives. Right. Science is what can we measure observably, and we can't observe other dimensions. So that's where there's a breakdown there.
Yes. So good stuff, Joel, on science. Thanks for setting the stage a little bit for that.
You're welcome, buddy.
I know. It was a great Herculean effort that it just required. So, okay. So when we talk about science, we're thinking about growing our knowledge of various topics. And so when so the big question was, when our knowledge starts to increase, can we reconcile that with our knowledge of the Bible? And so let's talk about different areas in which our knowledge has increased and is increasing. So we're going to talk about several different things. We're going to talk about a greater knowledge of genre, literary genres, their gifts and limitations. We're going to talk about a greater knowledge of Big Bang cosmology and geologic time. And then we're going to talk about greater knowledge of evolution here shortly. Let's talk about genre, to really get my French skills going. Genre. Joel, tell us what genre is, and how can awareness of it help us better approach the biblical text, or any text for that matter?
Yeah, genre, I think most people are familiar with in terms of like movies. There's romantic comedies and horror, and they tell stories in specific ways and have specific little things that they do. Like there's the comic relief character in romantic comedies. There's the jump scare in horrors. There's genres in music that use specific instruments because they are this genre. Like ska uses horns, that's versus reggae, which does not typically. Or like there's rock and post-rock, and they have all these nuances that they create. The same is with literature. There's certain techniques that get used that mean certain things, and they don't mean that in a different genre. So interpreting the genre, knowing the genre, helps you understand how to interpret what you're reading. So in the Bible, there's generally, roughly speaking, 3 or 4 different kinds of buckets of genres that can kind of drill down in: prophecy, poetry, historical narrative, and what's often called just epistles. Like, what do we do with Paul's letters? They're letters. But even those kinds of letters have different kinds of functions. There's certain kinds of prophecy. There's certain kind of narratives. If it's a narrative, is it historical fiction? Is it history? Is it fable? Is it myth? And then poetry and prophecy have different things too. And when we're talking about Genesis, The ones that typically get thrown around are poetry and narrative. Those are the primary ones. Some people argue for prophecy, which is, again, a very complex genre. But when we're looking at Genesis in particular, 1 through 11, which is everything from the creation narrative all the way up to the Tower of Babel, includes Noah's Ark, includes the creation, that what's called a cosmogony in chapter 1, and then chapter 2 and 3 are almost like a zoomed in picture of Adam and Eve, and it's almost like a second creation story that's disconnected from the chapter 1. Most people look at chapter 1 as more like Hebrew poetry, which, if you look at the cadence in Hebrew, is very easy to see.
It has almost like I remember in my Pentateuch class that the professor was talking about had a liturgical quality. You'd almost imagine people reciting it in a sense.
These are oral. These are originally oral. And how do you help things be memorable?
That's right.
You make them rhyme. You make them have a cadence. Like in Genesis chapter 1, where it says, the earth was empty and without form. It's tohu vavohu, which feels like, that's kind of catchy. Tohu vavohu. And then when you start getting into chapters 2 through 11, you're talking more about narrative, but it's debatable. Like, some see it as like, this is history telling. This is meant to tell me facts. Others will see this more like mythological narrative. The meaning, which is a lot of writing in the ancient world, was mostly in what we would call mythological narrative. And so which one you choose will determine how you interpret it.
Yes. Could you tell us a little bit also about, in Genesis chapter 1, the theories on Yom and literal 6-day creation versus
all different,
longer time period?
Yeah, this is, you get like young Earth creationists, old Earth creationists, deistic creationists who actually, they're more like evolutionists. They don't, some see this all as just kind of being created and guide, and some see evolution as the thing God created that guided things. Yom can be interpreted as, Yom is Hebrew for day. And so the 7 days of creation, what do those mean? There are those who argue it's a literal 24-hour day. And there are serious problems with that interpretation. Because first of all, like when you look at the creation story, God didn't create the sun until day 4. So how do you measure a day? That becomes almost like without meaning. Now, the younger creationists have their gymnastics that they do. God did it. It doesn't. It's just kind of like hand waving.
Right.
Don't look at what's happening over here. Just Then there are those who are very committed to science, and they will interpret day as like an era, an eon, and they'll point out in the New Testament when in Peter he says, to the Lord a day is like
1,000 years.
1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day. And so they'll say these are more like eons and eras, and which they'll try to then fit, like reverse engineer, like our understandings of when, like geologic time, when the birds came into being, when the fish came into being. The problem is the narrative does not actually fit our fossil records. The birds came first in the narrative, but that's not what happened with our understanding of archaeological understanding. The birds were not first. So that's kind of like, there's some issues there. And then there's just what the Yom is a figurative word. It's not trying to say any actual like measurable time. It's just a way that you communicate in the ancient world, and it's more of a figurative thing. And so if you look at the 7 days, it's almost, there's 2 sets of triads. The days 1 through 3 and days 4 through 6. And days 1 through 3, God creates these environments: the environment for light and darkness, the environment of sky and water, the environment of land. And then days 4 through 6, he fills those environments. On day 4, he fills the environment of light and darkness with sun, moon, and stars. On day 5, he fills the environments of the firmament and the waters with birds and fish. On day 6, he fills the environment of land with mammals, and his crowning thing being human beings. And on day 7, he rested. So the argument there is, this is a literary device that helps people remember it. That is, talking about the creation of God's creation of the known world, and it has nothing it's not even interested in talking about time frames.
Right.
It's trying to communicate God as creator.
And these kinds of questions probably, almost certainly, would not have been on the radar screen of people who were hearing this story centuries and centuries ago.
Mhm.
They're on our radar screen now because of that we know so much more about our planet and about the universe. So this just shows how things are changing with that. And the other thing to just add about genre is that genre, when you're talking about music and literature and movies and stuff, it sets an expectation.
Yeah.
That there's a general sort of compact between the producer of the material and the intended audience that this is what you can kind of expect from these things. And so there would have been expectations from the people reading the Genesis account of kind of, what this narrative can do and what it can't do.
Yeah. And also, it's hardly the only cosmogony in the ancient Near East.
And that's an amazing thing that I learned years ago, is that we took a look at other creation stories from the ancient Near East that probably would have been traveling around quite pervasively.
Yep.
And one that I was reading, I think it was in the Babylonian context, it was a story about how order descended into chaos, and then things were created from that chaos. Well, the Jewish story
It's the opposite.
is, in the beginning,
There was chaos.
there was chaos, and God brings order out of the chaos, which looks like a counter narrative. It looks like a competing story to reorient these people.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. And there's some parallels between some of the other ancient Near Eastern stories, Enuma Elish and some things like that. But there's also the uniqueness. And that's where I think it becomes interesting of what Genesis 1 is trying to do. It's trying to say something that's different or unique about the Hebrew God.
Yes. So one of learning those things became kind of a sticking point for me when I started digging deeper into the book of Genesis to see, like, is this really a reliable, historically reliable account, scientifically reliable account of how the earth came into being? Well, then I, like all of us, I learned about the Big Bang cosmology, and learned about how scientists are able to date fossils using radioactive radiocarbon dating and potassium dating, and measuring how much elements are left over after decay and so forth. And you start learning about, like, geologic time, that you start thinking about the earth in terms of not hundreds and then thousands of years, which if you just grow up in kind of a dispensational / fundamentalist environment and you don't dig into it, you can be led to believe that the earth and the universe are about roughly 6,000 years old, doing your math and stuff throughout the Bible. But when you dig into what scientific research shows, it becomes very difficult to reconcile.
They're
irreconcilable. And so,
you have to almost dismiss the science. And that's what a lot of young earth creationists do. Yeah. Yeah.
I had to bust you on that one.
But they will attack radiometric dating and carbon dating. They will attack these things and discredit them.
Yes,
because that needs to be brought into question in order for their views to be more credible.
Yes, yeah, right. Along those lines, why don't you tell us a little bit about Jesus horses as well, if you don't mind? I wasn't aware of this until the other day, but I find this fascinating.
Yeah. So I heard it first, this phrase, on Saturday Night Live with Tina Fey, was like when she was doing when she used to do the news.
Yeah, right.
And
Weekend Update.
Yeah. And I guess there was I think it was in Georgia, there was some educational decree to not, that you could teach evolution in science classes because there was a lot of controversy in this community. And then as a joke, she said, the families that were conceded to teaching evolution in science classes, provided all dinosaurs were referred to as Jesus horses. And then I actually taught a class like this when I was a pastor, and I was tried to be very fair to all the perspectives. In fact, I knew I did it correctly when people at the end didn't know what I actually believed, because I was promoting, just, hey, here's what this camp believes, here's what this camp believes. But for the slide at the beginning, I found an actual coloring book illustration from like some homeschool thing where Jesus is like riding a velociraptor. And on the caption, it just says, although we know that humans and dinosaurs existed together, we don't know if Jesus rode a dinosaur. And then ... but he probably did.
But he probably did.
What an assertion. Like, there's zero evidence of any of this other than trying to protect their very questionable commitment to reverse engineering the genealogies of the Bible. So therefore, the earth can only be this old. And then they have very complex ways of trying to describe, God made the earth look old. All the layers that we see were because of the flood. If there was this global flood, then of course it's going to throw off our models, and so
Yes.
There's not evidence. That the real thing is just trying to create reasonable doubt, as usually the tactics.
Yeah. If I could throw this in here too, Joel, I mean, so many of these conflicts are based upon an approach to the Bible. We'll talk about inerrancy in, I believe, a future podcast, but
absolutely,
this approach to the Bible, which is known as inerrancy, which basically means that there are people who believe that the Holy Bible, Old and New Testament, is completely free of error. In fact, incapable of being wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see it that way, it's just assumed that the Bible has the right answer on whatever topic, and whatever we might learn that would seem to counter or contradict that has to be either thrown out, or it has to be twisted to fit what Scripture talks about. I found that to be just intellectually untenable as I moved forward, even as I was in the height of my zeal for following the Lord and doing it in a conservative way, according to more of a conservative theological stance. I always had a difficulty with inerrancy because I just thought,
me too.
How could we even know if it's without error? But to say that something is incapable of error is the very definition of a faith commitment. It's not warranted by evidence. It's just, I must cling to this. And of course, when we've studied the text, there are inaccuracies and mistakes and contradictions and so forth. But even the notion that it couldn't have error just sounded ridiculous, even as in the midst of my strong belief.
It's a silly doctrine that we made up to protect our understanding of sacred Scripture. And a lot of faith traditions, Christian traditions around the world, including Catholicism, which is half the Christians on the planet, have a very different way of looking at the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they have their own kind of hang-ups around traditions and, popes speaking.
Papal inerrancy,
Papal inerrancy, and they have their versions of it. But it's primarily the Protestants who are so, like, this inerrancy, what it's created, in my opinion, as a pastor, what I've observed from listening to other pastors and watching people like develop beliefs from the teachings, is the Bible is really fundamentally what they're worshiping.
Mm-hmm.
They're not they will protect the Bible to the nth degree in their understanding of it, because that is the keystone of the linchpin, the foundation for everything that they believe. And if the Bible even begins to show cracks in it, it's terrifying for them. They have an the existential crisis just begins to loom over them. So that's why there's such fervor protecting this doctrine. What's so it was so frustrating for me as a pastor over the years. 12 years I was at that church. I was subtly, without telling people, trying to pry the Bible out of their closed fisted hands, lovingly pry it out of their hands so that they could love God and listen to the mysterious voice of Jesus. That was what I was trying to do, but the Bible would always get in the way.
And it's really strange too, because so many strong Christians of all stripes are that way because they've had powerful experiences, not just because or necessarily because of the Bible. And I think it'd be better for people to feel more bond with their experiences, and then go to the Bible as a tool, as one tool among others for knowing God. And, the Catholic Church recognizes the teachings of evolution and the Big Bang, and they recognize the concept of non-overlapping magisteria, and they've acknowledged that it's a valid way of seeing the universe. Probably a wise move.
I mean, they also threw Galileo in prison. So
No, I'm not exonerating him. I'm saying that even the Catholic, I mean, the Catholic Church has come along. Maybe others would consider.
Yeah. I mean, Roman Catholicism has had more time to figure it out than Protestants.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. So we've talked about genre and increasing our knowledge of genre and Big Bang cosmology, but evolution is the huge one.
Mhm.
So when we talk about evolution, we're talking about well, what I want to say about it is that it's why perhaps biological diversity is not a result of animals leaving the ark 2 by 2 some thousands of
Can you imagine
years
having
ago.
brontosauri on the ark? That's just like
Yeah, right.
or
Yeah.
I don't.
Or how much, if you had 2 elephants for 40 days, how much food would be required? What kind of tonnage are we dealing with here?
All the shit on that boat.
Just poop, shit everywhere. Wow. Anyway, but
it makes a very beautiful like flannel board picture though.
It's not the kind of story that you want to think about.
No.
The less you think about it, the better.
Precisely.
Experience.
Yeah. I mean, especially since the story is really about murdering almost every human being on the planet.
Yeah, God's decision to eliminate people for bad behavior.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, Joel, tell us about when did you learn about the theory of evolution theory of evolution by random mutation and natural selection? When did you learn about it? Do you agree? Are there parts of it that are unclear? Tell us more about your experience with evolution.
I mean, my experience with evolution was primarily to doubt it. I was always taught to doubt it, discredit Charles Darwin. I've only read bits and pieces of Origin of Species, but I also always had a kind of I'm open to truth. I'm a truth seeker. That's why I enjoy science, because it's an important data point for certain kinds of conclusions around what does it mean to be human, and like how do I find meaning in this big gigantic world and universe. And so when I would hear these kind of teachings, I'm not expert by any means, but I would hear it referenced to and applied to as like the normal science, right? Darwin promotes his theory. It's still a theory over all of this time. It's still a theory, but it's a theory that continues to work. I did read something just the other day where someone questioned evolution as a theory to understand the human brain, with the development of prefrontal cortex, and how the human brain developed. And they argue that evolution can't explain the way the brain is function, which I found interesting. This is what science does. It tests it. What's the evidence? Does the theory fit what we're finding? And so that's kind of my brush up with evolution, is that primarily I hear scientists use it as a useful theory that explains the data they're seeing when it comes to, biological diversity, when it comes to species, how they develop and evolve. And I mean, we see evolution happening in a lifetime. We will see certain like bugs or insects adapt to their environment and evolve and change. Macroevolution, which a lot of Christians are, I was taught to reject, because it's mean we're coming from monkeys or whatever, those kinds of things. And that seems to be very offensive for whatever reason. And my kind of like over time, my openness to this actually made the Bible like cleaner, because it was no longer like tethered to all these irrelevant, like evolution is not trying to make comments about the Bible, and the Bible's not trying to make comments about scientific theories. So it kind of made things cleaner for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that you've talked about this. I think this is wisdom. The goal is not to become fundamentalist about evolutionary theory, but to continue asking those difficult questions. There are people who are like scientific fundamentalists, where they're interested in dogma and not about continuing to, people should be encouraged to continue questioning evolutionary theory. Maybe it will stand the test of time. Maybe there will be tweaks to it, or perhaps it's conceivable that it would be overturned. But it seems to be, my understanding of it, it seems to be the best explanation for the phenomena that we see in the natural world. It has a lot of explanatory power for why there are distinct species. Is that a result of God creating distinct species, or is it a result of long stretches of time with laborious changes, very small, minute changes over millions upon millions of generations that generate the variety that we see, where species find the species that are most adapted, best adapted, not necessarily progressed or better,
Sure.
but best adapted for their environments are the ones that end up surviving.
Mhm.
And those random mutations generate those niches that allow a species to have an advantage over
Yeah.
another
I mean, all our understanding about breeding, for example.
That's right. Darwin talks about this in The Origin of Species. He uses that as a great illustration that when you see people who are breeding, they're aware of doing things, and you see changes happen within few generations.
Yep. Yeah, I used to have dachshunds, which were bred to hunt badgers.
Mhm.
That's why they have those big barrel chests. They're long because they can go down and dig down into their little T-Rex front paws. But those were like bred to be that way. And
Yeah.
I would say that I've noticed a growing acceptance of evolution amongst even Christian pastors and scholars, and which would be called theistic evolutionists.
Theistic evolution.
Yeah. But
Right.
I do want to point out some things that I learned in seminary. I mean, decades ago, I remember stuff like, were Adam and Eve real people?
Mm-hmm.
Or those kind of more representative symbols in a mythological tale. I mean, even there's a lot of debate whether Moses or Abraham were actual real people, or were they multiple kinds of leaders that, through the long, laborious process of oral history, over time became an individual to represent the memory of a people, and the stories that they told continued to tell themselves over time to hold on to a specific kind of identity. And all these things are being explored in academic settings. But the moment I bring that into a church setting, people would flip the fuck out. It just was terrifying for them. And it was really interesting to watch that psychology that most people are very, very uncomfortable with asking these kinds of questions.
Yes, if you are afraid that believing the wrong thing would send you to hell,
of course,
you will not be incentivized to ask the hard questions. And I was talking to somebody fairly recently who said it was when he was talking about his journey. He said when he started relinquishing the fear, the belief in hell, and the fear in what might happen to him, that allowed him to start asking certain questions. Asking questions like, what if the Bible was only written by humans and it wasn't necessarily divinely inspired? What kinds of things would be better understood if we recognize that they're written by human beings? We would see justifications for bad behavior. We would see coercive kind of language, and we'd see a lot of wonderful things, just like humans are. But if you aren't allowed to even theorize about it or hypothesize about it in that way, you'll never be capable of seeing those things. I've often wondered, what it would be like if you were a Christian in the first century and you sat down with Paul, like St. Paul. If you had a question, if you want to talk with him about spiritual things, you could never have an argument, because he would, by definition, because he wrote inerrant material, what he said would be right. So he would just go around different places to his churches, and he would know, and they should know, that he was just saying the right thing. So it would be a moot point to even argue. It's like, man, what a kind of lifestyle that would be. I wouldn't want to have a beer with him, I don't think, if I couldn't refute bad ideas or anything like that.
I mean, I get the feeling that Paul was not really super amenable to criticism.
Maybe that's why he traveled around so
he's
much.
like, I gotta get out.
I got about 3 months
who
here.
Actually knew Jesus think they know everything.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Great. So, all right. Okay, so we have the Bible, and then through time, we are learning more and more about our world in so many different areas. In literature, literary analysis, we're learning about archaeology, we're learning about astrophysics, astronomy, all these kinds of things. So alchemy is replaced with chemistry. Astrology is replaced with astronomy.
I mean, theology used to be in the medieval times the queen of the sciences.
Queen of the sciences. Yeah. And those are that has changed. So, okay.
Which is a good thing in my opinion.
Thing.
Yeah.
I agree. So, Joel, let's talk about possible responses that people can have, that we can have to our increased knowledge of the world around us. And I would say that, and feel free to chime in when you want to, but I would say one of those is just to ignore, just to put your head under a rock and pretend like these things aren't happening because it's uncomfortable and unsettling.
An attractive reaction.
Just ignorance can be bliss. We don't want to know. And we've seen this happen with really, really smart people, PhDs, people from upper echelon schools and whatever. They're just like, it's talking about non-overlapping magisteria. I'm going to be a whiz in this domain, and I don't want to know anything about the Bible. I want to go to church. You tell me what to believe. We're good, because that's enough for me. Hard to relate to, in my opinion.
It's so bizarre. I'm thinking of someone who's a Harvard educated person and just openly admitted, Joel, I can't argue with you about these things because I don't know most of what you know. But then the subtext was, but I'm just going to keep believing it, and I think you're wrong. And it was just like, how did you go to Harvard?
What is the story on that? Yeah. Wow. Okay. So, and then another option would be to push back, and to just push it away, to react harshly to it.
And you mean like criticism? And
criticism, intense criticism, but like really passionate.
Sure.
The other would be to like push down, like to just, and that's kind of along the lines of like ignoring. It's just like, we're going to deny that this is there. We're going to prevent other people from knowing about it too.
Minimize it.
We're going to obscurantize, keep it in the dark. Then another one would be to engage. That is, I believe this could be uncomfortable, but I believe learning is important. Knowing the truth is something that I value, and I want to engage with that and test and see whether the Lord is good. Test and see. Come, let us reason together. Though your sins are like scarlet.
He took a old Bible verse, taste and see, and switched to test and see. Did you guys feel that?
Ooh.
Yeah.
I felt that.
I got a little shiver.
And then another option is to like reinterpret. So we talked about literal 6-day creation. Could those be eras? You've got, those weren't really live questions about whether it's I think Augustine might have speculated that the earth was older than that.
I mean, he wrote so much, you can basically use some part of his writing to justify almost anything. Yeah.
But to reinterpret. So now what we're going to do is, now that we have new information, it forces us to go back to the text and try to understand it in a new way, so that we can go on believing that it's the case, which is sort of a more open-minded way of approaching it. But again, people ought to be reminded that this is these questions wouldn't even be relevant unless science, the investigation of science, made it possible to do that.
Yeah, I think that those are very interesting ways to kind of talk about different ways for people to respond. I have a similar kind of like analogy that I use. I always like to say we're all born in a room, right? And imagine you're younger, you're born in this room, you get to know all of it. You get to know the people in the room, you get to know the furniture, you get to know every square inch of that room, and you feel so comfortable and safe in that room. It's very familiar. And then at some point in your life, you discover there's a door. And you're like, what? I've heard people talk about doors. What are these things? And then one day you build up the courage to open the door and look through, and it's like, oh my God, there's a whole other room of exact same size. My universe just doubled in size. And over time, you kind of like go in and out, flip back and forth between the rooms until you become comfortable with that room. And then you discover more doors. And those rooms have more doors. And those rooms have more doors. And there's basically 3 ways that I feel like people will respond. They will retreat to the rooms of familiarity, shut the doors and go la, 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 la. Or they will sometimes reject the old rooms, like poo-poo on them. Now I'm so progressive now. So they'll shut the door and move into the new rooms. Like, I don't think like a child anymore. Or they reconcile all the rooms. They leave all the doors open, knowing that it creates some tension. They're not always all like, they don't always all fit, but I'm going to like hold on to all of these as part of my story. And I would say the conservatives get stuck in that first category of retreating to the rooms of familiarity.
Mm-hmm.
The liberals get stuck in the rejection model
Mm-hmm.
of just kind of poo-pooing on ideas and beliefs and rejecting the old rooms.
Mm-hmm.
But only a small percentage of both groups move on to that reconciliation, which is a lot of hard work for
Mm-hmm.
someone to
Mm-hmm.
do. And that's what I feel like you and I have been doing with the Bible, which both of us see it for the beauty that we see beauty in it, but the beauty we see in it isn't what our original room taught us.
Yes.
But we don't have to throw out the Bible just because we've changed our view of what the Bible is. It can still have some meaning,
Right.
and still be interesting and talk about the origin stories of this very well-known religion on our planet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting when you read it in those kind of ways, and can even kind of find devotional purposes.
Very much. Okay, so we have asked the big question, been trying to ask the big question, what happens to our relationship with the Bible when knowledge grows? Joel, how has your increased understanding of the world impacted you've answered this a little bit already, but maybe you could just recapitulate. How has your increased understanding impacted your relationship with the Bible? Like where you are today
Sure.
with it?
It's a complicated question for me because some of it is just autobiographical. Having studied and taught the Bible for so long, then going through a divorce, and then my experience with my old faith community, and just the pain of that ending, and my vocation ending, and no longer having a job that requires me to study and teach the Bible, and then kind of being on my vocational journey now, see what does it look like. Really struggling to find a church. I don't go to church now anymore. And I really miss the community, but I just don't, the Bible's not present in my life as much anymore. And I don't know that I would say I miss it. That's not a denigrative. I'm not trying to denigrate the Bible. I'm just saying that right now, it's something that it would be like me trying to hold on to some old things just for holding on to them's sake. I have a suspicion that the Bible at some point is going to kind of creep back into my life in a new, fresh way. But right now, a lot of my interests are exploring questions outside of the Bible around what it means to be human and a spiritual person.
And for myself, I think that I sometimes am reluctant to even say that I'm not a Christian anymore, to the extent that I recognize and have been told by people who know me well that I still base my life in so many ways on biblical teachings. That probably will never, I know that will never leave me. And I treasure many of the things that I've learned. And you and I, in our conversations, we can't help but come back to biblical themes, biblical imagery, metaphors, and so forth. It's just such a part of our lives. But I reserve the right now to pick and choose that which to reject which I perceive to be false, and to hold on to the things that I think are ethically sound and edifying to humanity, rather than a lot of the nastiness there.
And you were just telling me the other day about how valuable the story of Job is to you.
Huge. Yeah. That's one of the things that I have continued to read and study about. And like you, I imagine a few weeks ago, I felt like I needed a good dose of 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. I needed to be reminded of that, and I read that because I find it to be just quite secular and quite relevant. Okay. Well, unless, Joel, you have any closing thoughts.
No, I would just encourage people, wherever you are on the spectrum in terms of what you believe about Genesis 1 through 11, that come to your conclusions without having to reject other truths. Like, consider possibilities. Allow your imagination to let the field of possibilities be in front of you, instead of what I would call just a fearful, insecure approach of just, I have to believe it this way, otherwise this house of cards will crumble to the ground. I think it's a good thing to let the house of cards crumble to the ground, because if scientific discoveries, which are very like no one argues about most of these things, if that topples your faith, then what kind of faith is it that you have precisely? I would encourage you to be brave and to explore.
And I think one final thing I want to add to that too is that one of the main goals for this podcast for me and Joel is that we would stimulate further discussion and research and investigation for us and others. Our podcast is not meant to be the final word. It's not meant to be authoritative. It's not meant to be exhaustive. We've talked about, we've gotten, some feedback from some folks who are enjoying the show, or maybe it's ruffling their feathers or whatever. And we can't talk about everything. And Joel and I do have our particular perspectives. We can't represent every single one. In coming podcasts, we would like to do more in that way, but maybe got some creative ideas that we've tossed around. But it is our perspective. Take it for what it is.
Yep.
And we're not giving medical advice. We have training in theology, and we're reasonably well read in other areas. And so we're just riffing here. We're throwing things out to generate. We want to show what it's like to have meaningful, productive, fun conversations about things that we care about. So with that being said, this wraps up our episode of Genesis versus Science, another installation of Led Lindsay Alchemy of Unpopular Opinions.
Thanks, guys.